Let us begin by stepping into one of the most agonizing, exhausting, and psychologically demanding waiting periods in all of recorded human history. We must look past the polished, sanitized Sunday school versions of this story and aggressively confront the raw, gritty, and incredibly painful human reality of Abraham's timeline. When the Creator of the universe first spoke to Abraham and commanded him to leave his comfortable homeland to pursue a magnificent divine promise, Abraham was 75 years old. The promise was staggeringly beautiful and specific. "I will make of you a great nation." For a man whose wife, Sarah, was deeply barren and completely unable to conceive, this promise was the ultimate, impossible dream. It was the spark of hope that gave his life profound meaning. But here is the brutal, excruciating reality of what actually happened. Next. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. For an entire decade, the skies remained completely silent. Abraham and Sarah watched the seasons change. They watched their bodies grow weaker, and they watched the impossible timeline of biology aggressively mock their faith. The desperation became so completely overwhelming, the silence of God so deafening, that they foolishly attempted to force the miracle themselves. They aggressively took matters into their own hands, manipulating the situation by bringing Hagar into their marriage to produce a child named Ishmael. It was a massive, catastrophic human failure, born entirely out of the suffocating panic of a delayed promise. It resulted in massive family trauma, intense heartbreak, and bitter division. And yet, despite their massive failure, despite the ticking clock, and despite their profound human frailty, the faithful God of heaven did not abandon his promise. Finally, miraculously, and completely impossibly, 25 agonizing years after the initial promise was spoken, when Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 90, the laughter of a newborn baby broke the long, heavy silence of their tent. They named him Isaac, which literally means he laughs. Isaac was absolutely not just a normal child. He was the living, breathing, and tangible climax of a quarter-century of desperate tears, agonizing prayers, profound disappointment, and miraculous restoration. He was the absolute center of Abraham's universe. He was the undeniable proof that God was real and that God kept his promises. But hidden deeply within this magnificent, long-awaited miracle was a terrifying, quiet, and incredibly dangerous spiritual vulnerability. The brilliant theologian Tim Keller profoundly observed that true idolatry does not usually begin with evil things. It almost always begins with good things. A genuine idol is formed the exact moment we take a beautiful, legitimate, good thing given to us by God, and we aggressively elevate it into an ultimate thing. When the magnificent gift of God becomes more precious to our hearts than the God who gave the gift, the blessing silently mutates into a curse. Some blessings take so incredibly long to arrive and cost us so much agony to receive that we slowly, subconsciously forget they came from God. We start to arrogantly think we earned them through our patience. We deserve them because of our suffering, and we absolutely cannot live without them. For Abraham, Isaac had slowly, quietly transitioned from being the promised son to becoming the absolute foundation of his identity. Isaac was his future, his security, and his entire reason for existence. Abraham's heart had wrapped its fingers so tightly around the gift of this boy that there was absolutely no room left in his hands for anything else. This is the exact, terrifying precipice where millions of modern Americans find themselves today. We have prayed for the spouse, the career, the financial breakthrough, or the child for so long that when the blessing finally arrives, we aggressively build our entire kingdom around it, completely forgetting the king who provided it. And it is precisely at this highly dangerous, idolatrous intersection that God must intervene. It happened on what seemed like a completely ordinary, quiet day in the desert. The silence of the ancient landscape was broken by the familiar, majestic voice of Almighty God, calling out to the patriarch, "Abraham!" And Abraham, as he had done for decades, immediately responded with absolute readiness, "Here I am." But the command that followed those three words is without a doubt the most terrifying, horrific, and psychologically devastating sentence ever spoken by God in the entire Old Testament. The Lord commanded, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." Do not casually gloss over the sheer, unadulterated cruelty embedded in the specific grammar of that command. God did not just say, "Take Isaac." God intentionally, methodically twisted the knife into Abraham's heart with every single syllable. "Take your son," reminding Abraham of the deep biological bond. "Your only son," emphasizing the absolute devastating uniqueness and the fact that there was no backup plan. "Whom you love," deliberately targeting the deepest, most vulnerable emotional center of Abraham's soul. And finally, Isaac, naming the specific 25-year miracle. God explicitly commanded Abraham to take the very thing he loved most in the entire universe, carry him up a mountain, slaughter him with a knife, and burn his body to ashes on a stone altar. From every single conceivable human perspective, this command was utterly, completely, and terrifyingly impossible. Theologically, it was a massive contradiction. Yahweh was the God who fiercely condemned the child sacrifices practiced by the surrounding pagan nations. Logically, it made absolutely zero sense if Isaac dies. The covenant dies, the descendants vanish, and the promise of a great nation becomes a permanent, cruel joke. Emotionally, it was pure, unadulterated torture, asking a 100-year-old man to look into the trusting eyes of his miracle child and murder him with his own hands. If there was ever a moment in human history for a man to violently scream at God, to angrily demand an explanation, or to completely abandon his faith, this was it. Years earlier, when God had threatened to destroy the wicked, corrupt cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham had boldly, aggressively stood before God and fiercely negotiated for the lives of strangers. He had argued passionately with the Creator of the universe to save wicked men. But here, faced with the agonizing execution of his own beloved, innocent son, the biblical text records an absolutely stunning, deafening, and majestic silence. Abraham didn't argue. He didn't bargain. He didn't demand an explanation. Early the next morning, he quietly saddled his donkey. This immediate, silent obedience is not the behavior of a brainwashed, blind, religious fanatic. It is the breathtaking, awe-inspiring response of a man who has spent decades intimately walking with the Creator and has developed an absolute, unshakable, and irrational trust in the goodness of God's character. Abraham didn't understand the command, but he absolutely trusted the commander. This presents the ultimate, devastating challenge to the modern American believer. We want a God who only gives, who only blesses, and who constantly validates our personal dreams. We are perfectly fine with obeying God, as long as His commands align perfectly with our 5-year plans. But the brutal reality of authentic biblical faith is this. Sometimes God intentionally asks for the very thing that makes absolutely no human sense, specifically to test if you trust Him more than you love His gifts. He will point to the absolute most precious thing in your life, your reputation, your career, your financial security, or your dream relationship, and he will ask you to place it on the altar, not because he is a cruel, sadistic dictator who enjoys watching you suffer, but because he loves you entirely too much to let an earthly idol slowly destroy your eternal soul. The terrifying request to surrender your Isaac is the ultimate defining invitation to discover if God is truly enough for you when absolutely everything else is stripped away. When God delivered the devastating command to sacrifice Isaac, he did not instruct Abraham to walk to a convenient hill just behind his tent. He commanded him to travel to the region of Moriah. The journey from Beersheba to Mount Moriah was a grueling, agonizing 3-day trek across the harsh, desolate desert landscape. This specific chronological detail is not an accident. It reveals the profound, intentional, and excruciating psychology of God's testing. If God merely wanted an impulsive, adrenaline-fueled act of momentary blind obedience, he would have placed the mountain right next to the camp. But God intentionally built 3 massive, agonizing days of travel into the equation. He gave Abraham 3 long, quiet days to think. He gave him 3 silent, agonizing nights to stare up at the stars and reconsider. Imagine those 3 days. Every single dusty step was a massive heartbreak. Every grueling mile was a violent internal war between a father's profound love and a believer's ultimate obedience. This journey is arguably the most psychologically and emotionally torturous walk recorded in the entirety of the biblical text. Try to place yourself in Abraham's sand-worn sandals. During the heat of the day, as they walked side by side, Isaac would have looked at his father with absolute innocent trust. Every time Isaac laughed, every time he offered his father a drink of water, and every time he smiled, the invisible knife must have violently twisted deeper into Abraham's shattered heart. At night, as the campfires burned low and the servants fell asleep, Abraham would have sat awake, staring at the peaceful, rising and falling chest of his sleeping boy. The tears must have flowed silently into his beard. The temptation to quietly wake the boy, mount the donkeys, and violently flee in the opposite direction, to run away from God forever, just to save his son, must have been an overwhelming, suffocating, and almost irresistible demonic roar in his mind. The 3-day journey was designed to prove that Abraham's obedience was not a momentary lapse of judgment, but a deeply calculated, fully resolved, and fiercely intentional surrender. On the 3rd day, as they left the servants behind at the base of the mountain and began the steep, quiet ascent, the agonizing silence was finally broken. Isaac, carrying the heavy bundle of wood on his strong young back, looked at his elderly father carrying the fire and the knife, and he asked the most devastating, heart-piercing question a son could ever ask. "My father, behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" That question must have physically paralyzed Abraham. It was the ultimate crushing collision of his fatherly love and his devastating divine assignment. But Abraham's response in that exact fraction of a second reveals a faith so profound, so majestic, and so completely anchored in the character of God that it literally echoes into eternity. He did not break down in hysterics. He did not confess the terrifying truth to the boy. He looked at his son, his voice perhaps trembling but completely resolute, and said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." This was not a desperate, comforting lie told by a panicked father to keep his son calm. It was a massive, prophetic, and universe-shaking declaration of absolute faith. In the book of Hebrews, the New Testament writer reveals the stunning theology behind Abraham's mindset during this walk. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead. Abraham believed that God's promise of descendants through Isaac was so absolute, so unbreakable, that even if he plunged the knife into his son's chest and burned him to ashes, God would literally have to reconstruct the boy's body from the dust and resurrect him right there on the mountain to keep his word. Faith isn't the complete absence of terrifying questions. Authentic biblical faith is having the raw courage to continue walking up the mountain when the questions have absolutely no logical answers yet. You might be on day 2 of your own agonizing, silent journey right now. You are walking toward a terrifying outcome. Your heart is breaking, and absolutely nothing makes sense. But the story of Abraham demands that you keep walking. The provision is not found at the bottom of the mountain. The provision is waiting exactly where the obedience is completed. As the father and son finally breached the summit of Mount Moriah, the cold, harsh reality of the command could no longer be delayed by the journey. The walking was finished. The building had to begin. Abraham and Isaac began to gather large, heavy, unhewn stones to construct the altar. I want you to visualize this incredibly profound, heartbreaking scene. With every single heavy stone that Abraham lifted and placed onto the pile, he was metaphorically laying down a massive piece of his own heart. He was stacking up his future, his legacy, his identity, and his deepest joy. And the agonizing reality is that Isaac was actively helping him build it. The son was handing the stones to the father, completely unaware that he was helping to construct the very platform of his own execution. But as the altar was completed and the wood was carefully arranged on top, the narrative reaches a stunning, deeply moving climax that is very frequently completely overlooked in modern sermons. The biblical text simply states, "And he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood." We often picture Isaac in this story as a helpless, small, 7-year-old child who could be easily overpowered by his father. But historical and theological consensus strongly suggest that Isaac was a robust, healthy young man, likely in his late teens or even his early 20s. He had just carried a massive load of heavy wood up the side of a mountain. Abraham, on the other hand, was well over 115 years old. He was elderly, fragile, and physically weak. If Isaac had panicked, if he had fiercely resisted, or if he had decided to run, there is absolutely no possible way that a frail, elderly centenarian could have physically overpowered him, wrestled him to the ground, and tied him up. The staggering, beautiful, and undeniable truth hidden in this text is the absolute, voluntary submission of the son. The scriptures record absolutely zero resistance, no screaming, and no violent struggle. Isaac willingly allowed his elderly father to bind his strong hands and feet. The voluntary, sacrificial obedience of the son perfectly matched the agonizing obedience of the father. As Isaac lay quietly on the rough wood, staring up at the stormy, turbulent sky, Abraham reached out his trembling, weathered hand and slowly grasped the heavy, cold handle of the ancient sacrificial knife. He raised his arm high into the air. This specific, terrifying fraction of a second is not just a dramatic physical action. This is the absolute, ultimate, and cosmic climax of human surrender. In that exact moment, with the blade suspended in the air, Abraham was permanently executing his own will. He was completely, finally, and totally relinquishing absolute control over his entire universe. The altar is not just a pile of ancient rocks in the Middle East. It is the most terrifying and holy geographical location in the human soul. The altar is the exact painful place where you finally stop trying to fiercely negotiate with God and you simply, completely start trusting Him with absolute abandon. It is the absolute hardest place in the universe to build, but it is also the holiest. We love the comforting concept of God being our loving Father, but we violently resist the terrifying reality of God being our absolute sovereign King. The raised knife proves that Abraham had finally settled the ultimate debate of his existence. God was no longer just the provider of his blessings. God was the absolute, undisputed Lord of his life. Until you are willing to raise the knife over your most precious, highly protected idol, until you are willing to look at your career, your relationship, or your financial security and say, God, even if you take this away from me, you are still entirely enough. You will never experience the explosive, liberating, and magnificent freedom of true worship. The altar is where our idols go to die so that our faith can finally live. As the heavy, ancient sacrificial knife was raised high into the crisp mountain air, catching the glint of the morning sun, the absolute, unbearable tension of the universe seemed to snap. Abraham's arm was entirely committed, his muscles tensed, fully prepared to plunge the blade downward into the chest of his beloved, promised son. He had completely, totally, and authentically crossed the psychological threshold of the sacrifice. In his heart, the deed was already done, but in that exact, terrifying, and microscopic fraction of a millisecond before the fatal strike, a loud, urgent, and magnificent voice violently ripped through the silence of the heavens. "Abraham! Abraham!" The angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven with a double repetition of his name, signaling absolute urgency and divine command. "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him," the voice commanded. And then the voice delivered the most profoundly beautiful, liberating, and universe-altering validation a human being has ever received from the Creator. "For now, I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." The heavy knife instantly dropped from Abraham's trembling, exhausted hand, clattering harmlessly against the stone altar. The sudden, explosive flood of relief, the collapsing of absolute terror into overwhelming, tear-filled joy, must have caused the elderly patriarch's knees to completely buckle. He threw himself over the bound body of his son, weeping with a profound, earth-shattering gratitude that defies all human description. Time itself seemed to stop on the peak of Mount Moriah, and in that glorious, breathless aftermath, the massive, magnificent, and highly controversial theological truth of this entire agonizing narrative is finally, beautifully revealed. Here is the explosive truth that most people completely miss. God absolutely never, ever wanted Isaac's blood. He only wanted Abraham's heart. You must understand the dark, brutal, religious context of the ancient world surrounding Abraham. In the pagan cultures of the Canaanites and the surrounding nations, the sacrifice of firstborn children to bloodthirsty, demonic gods like Molech was a common, horrific, and accepted religious practice. It was the ultimate way a pagan proved their devotion to a false god. By issuing this test, Yahweh, the true God of Israel, pushed Abraham to the absolute maximum limit of ancient religious devotion, only to dramatically, forcefully intervene at the last possible second. God emphatically proved for the rest of human history that He is fundamentally, radically, and beautifully different from the demonic idols of the world. The God of the Bible absolutely despises human sacrifice. He did not want a dead body on the altar. He wanted a living, fully surrendered heart. This test was never about destruction. It was entirely, surgically, about purification. God saw the terrifying, silent idolatry that was slowly suffocating Abraham's soul. He saw that the magnificent 25-year miracle of Isaac had slowly mutated into an idol that was eclipsing the Creator. God issued this terrifying test because He loved Abraham entirely too much to let an earthly gift destroy his eternal soul. God wanted to know, definitively and publicly, if Abraham would continue to trust Him, even with the absolute most precious, irreplaceable thing in his entire life. This is the agonizing, beautiful reality of the divine test. When you finally stop fiercely gripping the things you love, when you finally open your trembling hands and completely surrender your absolute most precious dreams, your children, or your future, to the sovereign control of God, you do not actually lose them. When Abraham raised the knife, he fully surrendered his son. But when the angel stopped his hand, Abraham received Isaac back, not as a suffocating idol that demanded his worship, but simply as a beautiful, beloved son. The test didn't destroy the blessing. The test completely purified the blessing. When you finally surrender your ultimate Isaac to God, He cleanses it of its toxic, idolatrous power over your heart, and He hands it back to you, free from the crushing weight of your obsession. God's ultimate test is never designed to break you. It is meticulously designed to permanently set you free from the things that are secretly trying to master you. As Abraham slowly composed himself, wiping the tears of profound, overwhelming relief from his weathered face, he began to gently untie the thick, rough ropes that bound his son's wrists and ankles. The silence of the mountain was suddenly broken by a strange, shuffling sound nearby. Abraham lifted his eyes and looked behind him, and there, caught fast by its heavy curved horns in a dense, thorny thicket, was a single, solitary ram. It was completely unharmed, perfectly healthy, and trapped just a few feet away from the stone altar. God had not just stopped the sacrifice, He had miraculously, physically provided the substitute. Do not look at this ram as a mere convenient coincidence. The profound, staggering reality of this moment requires us to look at the timeline of God's providence. This ram did not magically materialize out of thin air at the exact moment Abraham raised the knife. While Abraham and Isaac had been silently, agonizingly walking up one side of the mountain for 3 grueling days, driven entirely by blind, terrifying obedience, Almighty God was actively, sovereignly directing the footsteps of that specific ram up the other side of the mountain. God was meticulously guiding the animal through the rocks and the brush, ensuring that it would become perfectly, tightly entangled in that specific thicket at the exact microscopic fraction of a second that Abraham needed it. Your painful, agonizing obedience today is actively preparing the magnificent, perfectly timed miracle of tomorrow. Abraham immediately took the ram, slaughtered it, and offered it up as a burnt offering in the exact place of his son. And in response to this overwhelming, breathtaking display of divine provision, Abraham gave that mountain a new name. He called it Jehovah Jireh, which translates to, "The Lord will provide." This was not just a sigh of relief or a polite expression of gratitude. This was a massive, prophetic, and eternal declaration of faith for every single generation that would follow him. Abraham was prophesying that the God of heaven is not a reactive, panicked God who scrambles to fix our problems at the last minute. He is the God who perfectly sees the need before the need even arises, and He actively prepares the provision long before we ever reach the summit of our crisis. But the majestic, mind-bending beauty of this specific mountain goes infinitely deeper than the story of Abraham. Mount Moriah is not just a random hill in the Middle East. Hundreds of years later, King Solomon would build the magnificent, towering Temple of God on this exact, specific mountain. And roughly 2,000 years after Abraham raised his knife on a rocky ridge belonging to this exact same mountain range, called Calvary, another father would lead his only beloved son up a hill. That son would also carry the heavy wood of his own sacrifice on his back. But on that dark Friday, when the Roman hammers drove the iron nails into the hands of Jesus Christ, the booming voice from heaven did not shout, "Stop!" The knife of divine justice fell completely, violently, and heavily upon the Son of God. The ram caught in the thicket of thorns was the ultimate, flawless, and beautiful preview of the cross of Jesus Christ. Abraham was asked to sacrifice his son to prove his profound love for God, but God actually sacrificed his only perfect son to permanently, undeniably prove his profound, scandalous love for us. God did not spare his own son so that we could be spared. When you finally open your tightly clenched hands in complete surrender to God, you will discover that he already had a ram waiting in the thicket for you all along. You are never, ever surrendering your life to a cruel tyrant. You are surrendering your life to the Father, who has already provided the ultimate bloody sacrifice to purchase your eternal freedom. Now that the dust has settled on the peak of Mount Moriah, the smoke from the altar is cleared, and the agonizing, heart-stopping tension of the narrative has finally broken, we are forced to violently confront the absolute, bleeding core of this entire biblical epic. The story of Abraham and Isaac is not simply a fascinating, extreme historical account of ancient obedience. It is a massive, highly uncomfortable, and fiercely surgical mirror held directly up to the modern human heart. It demands that we ask ourselves the most terrifying, exposing question in our spiritual lives. What are you holding on to so incredibly tightly that it has secretly, quietly become your ultimate idol? In our modern, sophisticated, and highly affluent American society, we rarely bow down to physical statues made of carved wood or molded gold. Our idolatry is infinitely more subtle, sophisticated, and socially acceptable. We manufacture our own Isaacs every single day. The Isaac is the frantic, exhausted mother who has tied her entire sense of self-worth and identity exclusively to the academic and athletic success of her children. If they fail, she feels completely destroyed because her children have taken the place of her God. The Isaac is the ambitious corporate executive who sacrifices his marriage, his health, and his integrity for the promotion, treating his career as the ultimate source of his security. The Isaac is the young adult who is absolutely, suffocatingly addicted to finding a romantic relationship, completely convinced that if they do not find a spouse, their life has absolutely zero value. These are not inherently evil things. Children, careers, and romantic relationships are beautiful, magnificent, and holy gifts ordained by God Himself. But this is the exact insidious trap of human nature. When we take a beautiful, finite, earthly gift, and we aggressively demand that it provide us with the infinite, eternal satisfaction, security, and identity that only Almighty God can provide, we completely crush the gift under the impossible weight of our expectations. We choke the life out of the very things we love because we are gripping them entirely too tightly. We turn blessings into gods, and those false gods will always, inevitably, demand our blood. This is exactly why God's terrifying command to Abraham was actually a profound, surgical act of massive divine mercy. God isn't a cruel, sadistic dictator. He's not eagerly asking you to lose what you love just to watch you suffer. He's asking you to trust Him with what you love so that it doesn't eventually destroy you. God knew that if Abraham continued to elevate Isaac above the Creator, Isaac would become a tyrannical idol that would ruin Abraham's soul and distort the boy's life. God demands the first place in our hearts, not because He is an egomaniac desperate for attention, but because He is the absolute only being in the entire universe who can actually support the massive, crushing weight of our human worship without collapsing. When God points His finger at the most precious, guarded, and beloved area of your life and says, put that on the altar, your immediate panicked reaction is absolute terror. You think He wants to take it away and leave you empty-handed and miserable? But the profound, liberating truth of Mount Moriah is the exact, beautiful opposite. God is desperately trying to teach you that you can never truly enjoy a gift until you realize you do not own it. When you finally stop fiercely, desperately gripping what you love, and you start completely trusting God with it, you don't actually lose it. You find it in a much safer, infinitely more secure place. You find it resting safely in His eternal hands. True, lasting peace is never found by aggressively controlling the things you love. True peace is found by completely releasing them to the God who loves them even more than you do. As we reach the magnificent, breathless conclusion of this staggering story, the ancient, dusty landscape of Mount Moriah fades away, and the intense, piercing gaze of the Holy Spirit focuses entirely, urgently, upon you. This ancient narrative is not just Abraham's story. It is aggressively, undeniably your story. Right now, in this very moment, what is the specific Isaac that you are desperately, frantically gripping with white knuckles? What is the one specific relationship, the one career goal, the one financial safety net, or the one carefully constructed dream that you are absolutely terrified to give to God? What is the one area of your life where you have subtly whispered to heaven, Lord, you can have absolutely everything else, but please do not touch this? I understand the profound, paralyzing fear that is currently gripping your chest. Opening your tightly clenched fists is the most terrifying, unnatural, and painful action a human being can possibly take. It feels exactly like stepping off a cliff in the dark. It feels like you are completely abandoning your control, surrendering your safety, and inviting absolute devastation into your life. You are terrified that if you actually lay your most precious dream on the altar, God will strike it with the knife and leave you weeping in the ashes. But I am begging you to look closely at the stunning, victorious end of Abraham's journey. The God of the Bible is not a thief. He is a magnificent, extravagant, and loving Father. The story of Moriah proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that whatever you completely, unconditionally surrender to God is never truly lost. It is purified, it is protected, and it is returned to you with the blessing of heaven attached to it. The Lord still provides. The magnificent, awe-inspiring God of Jehovah Jireh is still actively, fiercely alive today. He has not changed. Right now, in the very thicket of your current anxiety and fear, He has already miraculously provided the ram. He has already prepared the exact provision, the precise breakthrough, and the perfect grace you are going to need for tomorrow. But you will never, ever be able to receive the magnificent, abundant provision He has prepared for you as long as your hands are tightly clenched around your own limited plans. You cannot receive the new blessing while aggressively clutching the old idol. Your painful, tear-filled, terrifying obedience today is actively, meticulously preparing the magnificent, perfectly timed miracle of tomorrow. Do not wait until you have perfect, logical understanding of God's plan. Do not wait for the fear in your stomach to completely go away, because the fear will always be there when the stakes are high. The time for negotiating with the Creator is officially over. Take a deep, trembling breath. Walk up the mountain of your surrender and open your hands. Release the relationship. Release the career. Release the need for absolute control. Trust the brilliant, loving, and sovereign God who sees the ram in the thicket long before you even realize you need a miracle. When you finally open your hands in absolute surrender, you will discover that the hands of God are more than capable of holding your entire world. Open your hands and let the God of heaven do what only He can do.